ripple effect.
What's up? Another episode of the Ripple Effect podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Brandes, also known as Ricky Brandes, and a great episode for you today. Today we have returning guest, dear friend, somebody who's been on both my shows, The Union of the Unwanted and the Ripple Effect podcast a bunch of times. Alex Krainer, he's a researcher, he's a philosopher if you ask me, he's a thinker, historian, author, economic expert, and all around just a very interesting guy who's lived a very interesting life. And it always makes for, of course, a very interesting conversation. So I know you guys will enjoy this. And please also go back into archives and check out his other appearances on the podcast. And don't forget, this is a value for value show. So if you get some value out of these conversations, and I know many of you do because you guys reach out and tell me you like the show, please consider giving some value back. Everybody who has been donating, everybody who has been writing reviews, all that type of stuff, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I truly, truly appreciate it. The goal is for this year to be the year that I can successfully do this full time. And it wouldn't require a whole lot of money. I just need a little bit of support from you guys. I have thousands and thousands of downloads every episode, every month. And if everybody contribute just a little bit, even if it was $1 or 50 cents, I could do this full time. And everyone who's already doing that, thank you. You guys are getting me one step closer to doing this full time. If you can't support the show financially, let me tell you how you can do it. We have a Patreon page, and if you support me on Patreon, which is probably the easiest way of supporting me, and just donate $1. That's all it takes. If everybody helps out and donates a little bit, I can finally do this full time. So please go on Patreon. And if you do join me on Patreon and support the show via Patreon, I know some of you guys don't like Patreon, but the way I look at it is I'm using their platform to get donations for a show that they would most likely ban if I actually post clips on their platform. So they're unknowingly supporting content that they wouldn't approve of, which to me is kind of a way of saying F you to Patreon, because they are indirectly helping this show grow by giving you guys a platform and a way to donate and support my show. So that's kind of the way I look at it. But if you don't want to use Patreon, I do have a PayPal account if you want to donate that way. I also have a crypto wallet if you want to send Bitcoin, and also a merch store. The Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com will bring you right to that merch store. Or if you want to make it a little easier, you can go right to the Ripple Effect Podcast.com, hit on support, and find all the ways you can support the show. So you have a merch store with tons of cool stuff to check out. You have PayPal if you want to do a one-time donation, and you also have Patreon. And last but not least, I also have a Rockfin channel, and Rockfin is a YouTube alternative. So it's a video platform. You can go there. You can watch all my Ripple Effect podcast video episodes for free. You can also find my other show, which I host with Sam Tripoli, Charlie Robinson, and Midnight Mike, called The Union of the Unwanted. That's also on there. So subscribe to both shows and browse around, because you'll find tons of great content creators on the platform. And the cool thing about Rockfin is you can tip any episode you enjoy. So if there's a specific episode that really connected with you, a conversation you really enjoyed, you can tip that episode. And I believe just watching and subscribing to your favorite content creators gets us some more crypto. So great way of supporting us. There's tons of free content on there. I do have an exclusive Rockfin show called Ricky Rants on Rockfin. So you can get that on Rockfin. And then also, if you want to join me on my next Patreon podcast, which is a podcast I do with my Patreon supporters, you can join my Patreon page. So tons of ways to support the show financially. If you can't support financially, rate, review, do all that type of stuff. And I think that's finally it. Enjoy the conversation, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.
Happy New Year.
I'm good. I can't complain.
Okay, good. Good to hear.
How's the family? Everybody good?
Everybody's good. We just returned from, I spent a week in Croatia. We returned Sunday night. And so now it's back to my metastasizing to-do list.
Yeah,
So,
that's the bad thing about vacations is that it's, counting on what you do for a living. Typically, nobody's doing your work for you. So when you come back, it's still there waiting for you, or a lot of times it adds up.
yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. You can't cut it off after 8 hours.
Yeah, that's kind of the benefits of working for somebody else, because we have a small little construction company, and it's same thing with my podcast, same thing. It's like there's things I want to get done or have to get done, and if I don't do it, it just doesn't get done. Where
It doesn't get, yeah, that's right.
so when you work for somebody else, you can kind of just punch out, and it's somebody else's headache. It's like, okay, I'm not there, they'll figure it out. So there is a benefit.
Exactly. Somebody else's worry.
Exactly.
Yeah, in my case, whatever I don't do, it's just not going to be done.
Yeah, well,
Um,
you've dibble dabbled in a bunch of different things. I think I heard your interview on, what's the name of the show? I've listened to it from time to time. It was is it around the Empire? And right, I think you've been on the Around the Empire podcast, and I remember
yeah,
she did the intro, and she mentioned some things that I didn't even know about you. And I'm like, I've talked to Alex quite a few times. I'm like, and I don't know if I knew, or maybe maybe forgot that you're in the military and that you spent some time in Venezuela and like all this. I'm like, dude, this dude's don't wonder he has such an interesting perspective on things. I mean, you've absorbed a lot of different cultures and perspectives, and have done a lot of different things that kind of give you I don't know, just a unique opinion. I feel like.
well, a lot of things have been happening around me for a long time now. Starting with 1980s, hyperinflation, the crash, the unraveling of the socialist system, then, unraveling of the banking system in Venezuela, and then the war in the Balkans, and my service in the military, and now all of this. And your education kind of prepares you to understand a limited aspect of all of these things. So you're always like, what's going on? Like a lot of this doesn't make sense. And so you end up always kind of trying to figure out the explanations yourself, because nobody serves them up. And then, like I had the privilege of working as a hedge fund manager for about 15 years, where like the bulk of your job is research. You just research. You're supposed to figure out how the system works rather than just go by what they teach you in school, which is like a fast lane to bankruptcy. And so, yeah, like I've been kind of trying to develop a high resolution mental map of how the system functions, because as close to everybody, you at some point you intuit that this is not sustainable, and if it's not sustainable, it means it's going to crash at some point, sooner or later. And then like, what happens then? We have to replace it with something. So you need to kind of figure out things that are important, how they work, and what it is that we're supposed to do, rather than just following along like sheep. Yeah, so all of those things gradually over many years, like I'm 51 years old, is a lot of time to ponder various things, which I think, and not to mention today, like there are so many people doing such awesome research. It's hard to keep up, but like you don't need to spend 12 hours in the library anymore to figure out an answer to a question. You just like, you have the social media, you have YouTube, you have all these search engines, and you figure things out really fast. So it's a great time to be alive if you wanna understand the world.
Yeah, it's weird. In so many aspects, we do live in some of the best times ever in our ability to just, I mean, literally, there's nothing that you can't teach yourself and you can't learn and be,
Yeah.
equal to a person who had traditional type of learning in the subject.
That's right.
Universities used to have a monopoly on information, because if you grew up on a farm, or if you grew up poor, and you didn't have money to go to college, you didn't have access to the best professors and books and all these things. But now it's like you have no excuse. You have access to all the same information everybody else does. A teacher friend of mine once said this, and it's so true. He's like, well, why teach anything that you can look up? Right. And it makes perfect sense, because it's true. Like, if a child can look it up, why am I just teaching that? But then I guess you go into the subject of like, well, then what exactly do you do in school all day, and what do you focus on? And which I guess you get more into maybe philosophy or arts or these other more creative things, which I think are super beneficial. And in many cases, people kind of look down upon it. And I mean, like, especially in America, people think great jobs, and they think lawyers, they think doctors, they think investment bankers. And a lot of times it's just like you're taught something, and that's, you follow those rules, and you don't really have a whole lot of critical thinking skills. One of my good friends, he's Polish, and he's a Polish immigrant, and he's really good with numbers. Like, just he got his CPA license really young, and just amazing with numbers. But we always joke around about like how some of his common sense is just like non-existent, and it's just but you see a lot of that. You see people who are some people are really book smart, and it's like we've created a system that you can succeed financially and succeed in the world of education if you just follow these rules. You just memorize this information, you regurgitate, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's molding the most interesting or most critical thinking humans, right?
Yeah. I think education is something that has to continue all your life. I guess when you go to school, you learn a craft, or you learn a profession. Let's say learn a profession, but it doesn't end there. It doesn't end there. Like, inevitably you find yourself questioning just about everything, and then once you question it, in fact, I find that the best thing to good quality education is to always question things, because practically the minute you asked the right question, you're on your way to getting the right answer, even if it doesn't come to you immediately. Maybe it comes to you in a roundabout way, but you get it. The critical thing is to ask the right question. And the problem with education is that it kind of equips you with answers. Like, you think you've learned things, and now you're done with that, which is, in a perverse way. I find that in this particular circumstance that we're in now, one of the most frustrating professions that I find is the doctors themselves, because many of them, they don't ask questions. They parrot answers, and if you talk to them, you realize that they're not parroting those answers because they actually know the stuff. It's just because they're really parroting it. But common sense, I don't know if that can be taught. I think maybe it drops away if you get too attached to the answer that you're given by, let's call it, authorities. But I think that today, even that's changing a lot. I don't know, like a few months ago, I was watching a Joe Rogan podcast with Graham Hancock. Okay. And it's very interesting, Graham Hancock's perspective, because when he started publishing his series of books, I think the first one was the Fingerprints of the Gods. He said that he was taken as a quack, and people kind of deferred to authority, and the authority said, no, Graham Hancock is just a quack. It's just like writing nonsense. Well, 20 years later, that's all changed dramatically because people have stopped deferring to authority. That is, they no longer accept that people who teach, I don't know, Egyptology at Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard are necessarily authorities. So they're a lot more open-minded to, hearing out Graham Hancock, hearing out, I don't know, David Icke, same story. Not that I, I don't put them in the same, they're two very different people, but, people are now much more open-minded to questioning authority, to questioning the answers that, things they thought they knew. And I think by that very virtue, uncovering the real answers to things that matter to us today. And so, generally, I tend to be very optimistic about where humanity is going at the present moment. But, it's all very fragile. So we have to kind of keep doing these kinds of things, speaking out, expressing the truth as we uncover it or as we perceive it, even if we're not 100% certain, because other people will, there's corrective action by speaking to a crowd. Somebody, if you say something wrong, somebody will shout back, "You're wrong." It's not like that. It's like, and then whatever, you adjust. But it's something that I think has never happened in humanity's history, that information is flowing so quickly and that knowledge is kind of expanding rapidly on the global basis. And I think we can't even, at this moment, we can't even kind of envision what this entails, what the changes that are going on will materialize as, And one of the, one of the things I always forget it word for word, and I'm probably going to butcher it again, but I came across this beautiful quote by Confucius, and I think it's very encouraging to think in these terms. And he says, when the great tree falls, it falls with great noise and destruction, right? But seeds grow without any noise; they grow silently. And so I think that what we're perceiving in the world today is maybe such big structures crumbling and crashing, and that's it's almost mesmerizing. You can't help watching and thinking oh my God, what is the world coming to? Everything is turning inside out and upside down. But at the same time, you can't really account for the hundreds of millions of seeds that are sprouting by us learning, understanding, connecting, and probably charting a new path that has never been taken.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic for the future. I've been asking a lot, obviously, with New Year's right around the corner. I've been thinking a lot about what does 2022 bring, and you talk to people, and it's amazing how drastic the opinions are. Some people believe the worst is yet to come. Other people believe, like myself, I feel I feel pretty positive about this year and coming years. I feel how much worse can it get in regards to you literally locked down the whole country already? Kids were learning from home. People were not getting together at all, in 2020. We were basically at the break of martial law. I mean, people were talking about, tanks in the streets and stuff. Luckily, it didn't go to that far. But it's, in America, I feel like there's enough resistance where maybe the worst is behind us. And I also think America, we're influential enough where if we resist enough and we succeed, that the rest of the world might follow. And I don't know, because it seems like other countries are definitely doing much worse than we are in regards to people just going along with it. I've said this over and over again, how disappointed I am in my own country, in Portugal. And it boggles my mind how everybody I don't know if it's just because they just want to, it's that whole thing. It's almost like everybody who got the vaccine initially, even people like Dr. Robert Malone and others, who I think a lot of people just we're traumatized by the situation. We're social creatures. We were put in isolation. Not myself, because I still told people to come over and try to gather with people who felt comfortable doing so. But a lot of people didn't get together with anybody, or maybe didn't have anybody who was willing to get together with them, and they were willing to do anything to make to make that end and to make that stop. And it was such a well played trick, because that's how they got everybody to just go along with it and not ask questions. And I mean, so many people I talked to that got vaccinated would constantly say the same thing, like, oh, I got it just so I could travel. I got it. I've heard Jordan Peterson get all upset about, he's like, I got your vaccine and now, like, leave me alone, that type of thing. And it's like, I think that's the feeling that a lot of people have. It's like, okay, I thought if I did what you told me, that you would leave me alone, and now you won't leave me alone. And one, I think they're a little bit just naive to the fact that, like, it wasn't ever about leaving you alone. It was about justifying never leaving you alone. And that was really the intention in the first place. But I feel like we're making strides in the right direction. Things that, you've been on my podcast a bunch, you've been on both podcasts, even the you've done Unwanted. I mean, things we're talking about on these shows, and a lot of the shows that you've been interviewed on, are now acceptable. Like, people are talking about it. I mean, not in all mainstream media, but lab leak theory, suppress treatments, all these things that are becoming more mainstream. Like, I feel like you can only suppress the truth for so long. And I've been wrong in the past, because there's been times where I'm like, this is going to be a game changer, like the Fauci emails, when out of his way, and it was shown in the emails, he went completely out of his way, and he knew that they needed to suppress the lab leak theory. Like, that was something that they went out of their way to suppress. They didn't want people to think it came from that lab. So the secrecy of it all, the fact, you're like, oh my God, people are going to finally stop listening to this guy. And then next thing you know, he's on TV again, and people are listening to him. And I'm just like, what is going on here? But I truly believe that it's like baby steps. Like, we can't expect a Joe Rogan podcast to completely change things overnight. But I think having people on like Dr. Peter McCullough and Dr. Robert Malone, I think Rogan has turned the tides in his own opinions and how important this is. When Dr. Robert Malone was on his show, and he was saying, thank you, Rogan, for having us on and for giving us a voice and using your platform. Rogan in the past has never really felt comfortable with compliments. You can tell he always feels uncomfortable. Like, people talk about how big his show is or how influential he is. And typically he tries to like change the subject, or he seems a little uncomfortable, but he kind of let Dr. Robert Malone say those things almost in a sense of like, he understood that with his platform, he felt like he because he's never really he says this all the time, he never really feels like he owes anything to anybody. Like, he's just doing what he loves. He likes having conversations. He's not trying to purposely influence people or change lives. It's just something that just came along with the podcast. But now it almost seems like he sees it as a priority, as a obligation almost, to use, like they say, like, with great power comes great responsibility. He feels like he has a responsibility. There's a recent podcast, and typically this will happen to me, where I can't sleep at night, and then I end up staying up watching something. And then the worst part is, I always have this dilemma of, let me find something interesting, because I might as well watch something interesting if I can't sleep. But then if it's too interesting, it guarantees that I won't sleep. So I'm like, this balancing act. But Michael Malice and Lex Fridman had a podcast that was just released, and Lex Fridman was to Eastern Europeans, just like yourself, and very fascinating. I love both those guys, and together it's awesome. I've always been very fascinated with Eastern Europe. Coming from a Western Europe, it just the culture and everything has always been really fascinating to me. But Freeman was talking about how Rogan text messaged him after he had the Greek CEO of Pfizer on his show. I don't know if you knew this, but Lex Fridman had the CEO of Pfizer on his show.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did come across that bit of information.
Yeah, and he said that Rogan like text messaged him immediately, like upset, and I'm like, holy shit! Like Rogan is on board. Like he understands that he's giving this this propaganda a platform, and you're letting this guy come on with very little pushback, and you're letting him come up with all his bullshit excuses on this and that, and didn't push back, and there's going to be people who like it or not. I mean, if you have a huge podcast, people look up to you, people respect your opinions, even if they shouldn't I guess put them on a pedestal. If you like somebody, you're going to respect their opinions, and to have him on, makes you think like, okay, if the scientist guy has him on and agrees with the Pfizer CEO, and the MMA guy comedian disagrees, like the scientist guy's probably right. I'm not going to do my own thinking. I'm just going to assume that he's probably right. He's looked at the science. It makes sense to him. But I think he is a great ally in all this, and I'm so glad that he came around and he sees the importance in this, because I truly believe that, like, everybody, like yourself, anybody who's outspoken, and I've seen your posts, I've seen your interviews, you've been outspoken throughout all this, and anybody who's been willing to, because now I feel like it's much easier to be outspoken, because like I said, a lot of these things are acceptable in the mainstream, but people like yourself and I were saying the same shit in 2020 when everybody was losing their mind anytime you said anything that went against the mainstream narrative.
Yeah.
But I think we're all contributing to something, and I think we all understand that this is huge. Like I people keep saying it, and I keep having these religious people or spiritual people on the show who talk about like this spiritual battle or war that we're in, and it kind of feels, do you get that sense? Like do you, I'm like, I'm not even sure what that means. Like I'm not, like, I don't know if it's the good versus evil thing, but it does feel like something, like humanity needs to be saved right now.
Yeah, I do get that sense, and I've been observing that a lot of people, as they, as they wake up to the fact that something is terribly, terribly wrong with what's going on in the world now, that almost invariably, as they speak about it, the line of thinking kind of converges on ultimately something spiritual. And I've seen that in many people, because honestly, I never had a shred of doubt from day one when the pandemic was declared that this was a hoax. And the reason why I was certain about it is because we've had, like, I think we've had, over the last 20 years, we've had more than 10 of these things, like SARS, MERS, swine flu, bird flu, Zika, like one after another. And, like I looked into some of them and I thought something, like they're doing this on purpose. And I've seen, like they went quickly with these vaccines, and then, like some labs caught batches that were, like there was clearly something behind it. It wasn't just like, oh, some pathogen just like blew up in our faces, and now the authorities are scrambling to save lives and to prevent. No, there was clearly something very different behind the scenes. And so I don't know, Zika got me to look quite deeply into it, and at the time I even wrote an article about it. But like it wasn't a terribly it was a, like Zika kind of vanished suddenly off the media radars, so it didn't get a lot of interest. But I kind of became a bit sensitive to the warning signs that there's like some kind of an agenda afoot. And then, like when they started shutting down schools, I mean, I've never seen that before. I don't know anybody who remembers such a thing being done, and that was, a clear sign that they crossed the Rubicon. But they also prepared to create a general psychosis in the society by, like in the beginning, you saw those photographs of people dropping dead in the street. You saw pictures of hospitals overwhelmed. I think we haven't seen that before of all these doctors and medical staff wearing hazmat suits, and like suddenly this imagery was the same as the stuff we were watching in Hollywood movies and all these TV shows. As soon as suddenly all this, how do you call it, invokes a fear. And so once there was fear, people kind of went along with the program, like, okay, you lock down, you stay home, use these hand sanitizers, wear your masks, everything, and people went along with it, except that the whole project was so poorly conceived and so poorly executed that already weeks into it, the incoherence was becoming obvious. And so I think that, I always thought it was very important to speak out because I knew I wasn't alone. And if you're kind of cowed into silence, then people who think like you don't know that they're not alone. And so one of the strategies that they use in all these things is they always use this astroturfing where they give you a strong impression that if you think otherwise than the crowd, that you're a very small minority of weirdos, and so better keep quiet so that people don't uncover you. But in fact, you're not a small minority of weirdos. And I think that the more of us speak out, the more people then learn that they're not alone, and the more they gain confidence to voice their own opinions and to take a firm stand. And I think that like you're right to point out that, like when one fact breaks out, like the fact that Fauci was lying and lying again and lying again and lying again, that one fact doesn't change anything. But it does kind of gradually strengthen the one side, and it saps the energy of the other side, because this agenda, to drive it forward, like they would need to execute flawlessly, and the agenda would have to be executed by people in leadership positions who need to have a certain charisma to tell people, do this, do that, don't do that, don't say this. Like, to follow a leader, you have to have a certain respect for the leader. You have to say, I'm not sure about this, but that person is telling me to say this or do that, so I'm going to do it. But if your leaders are hollow people like Fauci, like, I don't know, Francis Collins, like Boris Johnson, like, what's that woman in Walensky in the NIH in the United States now? Like, all of these people have a charisma of a wet rag. And so it's very hard for them. It's very hard for people, like the real quality people who should be driving this agenda forward, to actually take orders and to say, all right, I'm convinced, I don't know everything, but I'll do as I'm told, because I believe in the people leading the charge. So, the whole thing kind of starts to unravel, while the other side gains power, they get emboldened. And so what you see now, like, okay, yeah, people in Portugal, people in Italy, well, everywhere, people went along with it at first, and they thought that they would be doing the right thing by getting the vaccines and everything. But now what you have is, you have literally millions of people out in the street practically every weekend all over Europe. And that's where you can't convince anybody anymore that they're in a minority. Like, what? I'm a weirdo? What about all these millions out in the street who are like saying the same things that I perceive and I feel? So I think that inevitably, the agenda unravels, except that it's such an unprecedented, monstrous project. I think, without a doubt, it's the worst crime ever premeditated and perpetrated against humanity. So these people cannot reverse. They cannot retract. They, like that's exactly the case of when you ride on the tiger, you're terrified to dismount. So even though everybody knows that Fauci lied, he has no choice but keep on lying and, hope that somehow some miracle will make him whole and redeem him. But that's not going to happen. And then the next danger is that they switch queries and try to lead us into war, because that then would justify all kinds of other abuse and authoritarianism and dealing with any dissent and opposition in a very harsh way. So I think that's the next thing that we have to watch out for and avoid.
So you think tensions with some countries are gonna build, and what conflict do you see, you think, that could happen?
I'm not sure, but I'm, like, very obviously they've been escalating tensions with Russia and with China. These are two obvious big adversaries, and a big war could make all this go away. People could, forget about the pandemic, and the business of war would be the business of the nation. And what happens once the war gets going is that even if you don't like your leadership, people generally close ranks. Questioning the leadership becomes unpatriotic. It becomes tantamount to treason. You can no longer discuss the other side's point of view with any nuance to say, like, well, the Chinese have they have their own interest, the Russians have their own interest. No, you're at war, and you better learn to be patriotic and get ready to die for your country and so forth. So triggering some kind of a war would be a lifeline to these very same parasites that got this pandemic going. And I think that this is something that, as they say, what was it, the preamble of the UNESCO founding of the UNESCO, they said that since conditions for war are created in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men where the defenses of peace have to be built. And I think one of the critical things to consider is that the other side are human beings as well. They have their interests, they have their aspirations, and Russians don't hate Americans, the Chinese don't hate Americans. They are nations with their own problems, with their own interests, with their own security concerns and so forth. And a war is not a foregone conclusion. Their concerns are not inevitably a cause for escalation and for hostile posturing. So I think I kind of find it welcome that the Biden administration is holding an open line with the Russians, that they are discussing, because the alternative, the persisting, the nonstop, completely unnuanced demonization of Russians, of Vladimir Putin and so forth, is not going anywhere good. Like every time you had a war, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, it's always preceded by the demonization of the leadership. Assad, Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, the Taliban. First, for months, they brainwash you how horrible these people are. And then, by the time everybody hates them, then it's kind of easier to say, like, what, we have to go and kill them to make the world a better place. And to this day, like, you have Tony Blair going and say, like, going to Iraq was a great thing, and we definitely made the world a better place, but except it didn't. And so I think that's the next pitfall, the next trap. Again, I have to say I'm a little bit optimistic because I see that the various gambits to try to get the war going haven't succeeded so far. And so, you know, I'm moderately optimistic about that as well.
Yeah, it's weird. I've thought about this before too, about you know, when tensions after the the 2020, the pandemic kind of started toning down a little bit, and then you started hearing more rhetoric about Russia and China again. They were going back to what they were doing before 2020, and just you know, demonizing those countries and what they were doing. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure neither of the two are great people who are doing only great things, and there's probably some justification to some of the things that the American media say about those governments and the things that they do. But the truth is, we do the same shit, and it's no different. I mean, they look after their interests. We have, you know, our U.S. has their own interests that they look after, and they're all countries trying to just gather as much power and resources and influence as possible. And you almost need the three to exist to kind of keep you know, the world powers in check. You know, you can't just have one world power. You need another country that is close to the equivalent, so and then they can kind of keep them in check a little bit. Because if not, then, you know, you just go around raping and stealing from everybody. But I thought about how, like, if a war started, as bad as this sounds, that it almost would take all the focus away from the pandemic, and it would almost be behind us, because now all the focus is the war, you know. And which is to me a much bigger and more serious threat, because as we know, the virus, you have a 99% chance of survival. But if you're, you know, if you're in a war, if you're in that type of conflict, you know, nobody knows what the percentage is. It counts how violent it is. So it almost seems like I felt like a big story, the next big news story, or the next big conflict with another country could lead to us maybe turning the page on the pandemic. But you know, I could be wrong on that too.
Well, you know, generally the percentages of you know, war casualties are actually relatively small. You know, I don't know, if you look at the percentage of British, French, American population that died during World War II, they're very small. You know, they're like, well, with the exception of Russia.
I was gonna say the Soviets lost the most people.
The Soviets lost by far the most people, but you know, like I think the casualty counts for United States were less than 1%. For Britain and France, it was, but I forget. But you know, not, you know, like, you're not talking about 5% of the population. You're talking like between 1 and 3 maybe. But the problem with war is that it suddenly creates this emergency that justifies all kinds of abuse. You know, like you know, your pension wasn't paid out. Tough. You know, we're at war. You can't get an appointment with your doctor. Tough. We're at war. There's no fuel. Well, you know, blame the Russians or the Chinese. And it also justifies extremely harsh ways of dealing with opposition, with dissent. I guarantee you that if a war broke out, Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, Jimmy Dore, like, you name it, would be off the air and in a blink of an eye. Not only off the air, maybe they'd be, you know, maybe you guys would be playing cards in some detention center somewhere. You know, maybe you'd lose your freedom physically. In wars, government can requisition assets, resources, labor. You know, you could be shipped off to a labor camp somewhere because, you know, it's war. You have to do your part. And so generally, it's not the casualties, it's the complete destruction of the social fabric of the economy. You have rampant famines that go along with war. Like there's no food. Nobody's going to report that you have no food to eat, that your stores are empty. All the news are going to be about, like the Russians bombed this, we bombed that, and the people suffering suddenly becomes invisible. And so I think the war would be by far the worst outcome for ordinary people, but it would be by far the best outcome for these bloody parasites that are running the show still. The Davos crowd, the Wall Street, City of London banking cartel, these kinds of people, they would be absolutely saved by a war.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, you saw after September 11th how, they just used that to justify, enhance interrogations at Gitmo and all the surveillance and all that stuff. I mean,
exactly.
Exactly.
They're doing away with the habeas corpus, running these clandestine flights, shuttling people to torture camps all over the world. Yeah, it's thing that nobody should desire unless they're really demented and unless they belong to one of these cartels that thrive on war.
Well, I feel like this issue, the whole lockdown and everything that came with it, has tapped into Americans in a way that war never has. Because the thing about wars, and I've said this in the past a bunch, is that when we were in Iraq or Afghanistan, whenever we decided to go into these countries, Syria, these tensions build, they get more mild, they get more serious, they go back and forth. Most people's lives, if you weren't paying attention to the news, like the wars weren't going on here, they're going on over there. So like most people's lives weren't that affected. So it was hard to get people to get passionate or concerned about wars, because they're like, I can't find Afghanistan on the map. I don't give a fuck what's going on over there. I get to go out to eat with my wife. I get to bring my kids to school. I get to now, like, this issue hit us at home and in our most private places, and giving, it's seeping into our most private parts of our lives and just every aspect of life. So I think people are extra motivated. The US has always been really good of almost detaching us to our conflicts, like where we almost don't understand what war is because we don't see it. They during the Iraq war, when they said it was out of respect for the dying troops, but the news was reporting and showing images of the caskets of the soldiers coming back, and then the Bush administration told the news to stop doing that, and they said it was out of respect for the families. I think it was a much more of a PR thing, where it was like, hey, how about we keep using this word war, and we're in this war, but let's not let people see it, so they don't connect the images to the word. And that's all it is. It's a wordplay. It's PR tactics. It's the same reason why the Department of Defense used to be called the Department of War, and now it's Department of Defense, because it sounds better, So it's
sure, yeah.
I think most people just don't really even understand what happens in a war zone, or people think the anxiety of 2020 was scary. This idea of like not knowing what's going on, and is this virus lethal or not? Imagine living somewhere. Where was it? Was it Yemen? Where I remember reading this article about how people were afraid of clear sky days because that's when the drones came out. Imagine living in that type of just anxiety and just being that afraid every day, because a lot of these drone attacks were like based on metadata. It was like some cell phone or something that they were looking for. The amount of just like just unknown casualties of innocent people. Who knows how many? I think there was some report about how accurate these drone attacks are, and they're like super not accurate. Like it's based on like just small pieces of information, and there could be people near them, and so it's like to live in that type of anxiety and stress, I mean, it's unimaginable. So there's something about Americans that it's hard to convince them to be, like the 60s Americans who were protesting war, and the 9/11 stuff like that. Definitely, protesting 9/11 was and the Iraq war and all that stuff that did exist, but not to the extent that we used to, because I think we don't understand what war is. We don't understand what it's like to live in those countries. When you talk about people not having food, stores not being filled, Americans are like, not around here, like I'm like I'm good. Like, they don't even know what that's like. That's why when people didn't have toilet paper in the US, people were panicking. I'm like, toilet paper? You could figure shit out if you don't have toilet paper. I mean, some people don't have clean water. They don't have food. Like, they have like life-threatening issues, not just toilet. Like, that was our big thing. Like, we didn't have toilet paper and everybody's freaking out. Oh my God, the world's ending. We don't have toilet paper. It's weird. I almost feel like we're detached from it.
Well, yeah, and part of the reason is that the propaganda machine in the United States is it's a miracle to behold. It's a massive industry that has, that is very abundantly funded. They attract the greatest, the best and the brightest talent, and their job is to sanitize war. Their job is to make you feel good about war, because like, it wasn't so long ago that people were still talking about, like, this is the greatest force for good in that the world has ever seen. Except, like, if you take trouble to look into the way this force for good actually impacts its target nations, it doesn't look good. Like, 20 years in Afghanistan, the rate of poverty has doubled. I've seen estimates that 90% of all those drone strikes were innocent people, and I think that about half of them were women and children. Something like 52% of all Afghans, all children in Afghanistan, have suffered irreversible damage from malnutrition. The food insecurity and severe starvation, severe food insecurity is staggeringly high. It's like more than 50% of the population. So it's like real suffering among the people. Similar things you could say about Syria, about Libya, about Yemen, Somalia, like Sudan, whatever. But the American people are obviously lied about all that, because they need their consent for all those wars. And those wars are not fought for the benefit of the American people. They're fought for the benefit of a very, very narrow segment of stakeholders who own the corporations in the military-industrial complex, and their banking overlords, who are always present there, who need other nations' resources as collateral to run their credit creation scheme. So obviously the suffering is on both sides. The American people don't feel the suffering quite as much, but if you quantify how much money goes on those wars, year after year after year, you have like something like $1 trillion military budget, defense, right? Which is, I don't know, which is openly declared some 700 and some billion, like 760 billion. But then a lot of it is booked under Department of Energy. All the nuclear side is not under Department of Defense, but under Department of Energy. And so basically, when you put it all together, you come close to $1 trillion. Well, $1 trillion is a lot of money. I think it's like something like $3,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States. And so year after year after year after year, how much better off you would be. And then, not to mention that, but if you look at the infrastructure, obviously there's not very much money left over to maintain the infrastructure. So, like, I don't know, today you had like a massive spill of raw sewage in the streets and into the ocean in California. Because if all the discretionary spending goes on airplanes and bombs and missiles and maintaining 1,000 military bases all over the place and having all these secret operations in like 50 out of 54 African countries that even Congress cannot know about, obviously all that money is taken away from things that would make Americans a lot more prosperous. You would have, safe neighborhood and better schools and better hospitals and better access to all kinds of things that is, slowly taken away. Like they took the greatest economic power in the world, the most prosperous nation ever, and they slowly drained it of its wealth and of its resources to go build their empire. And it's not your empire, it's their empire. It was only your resources, your tax dollars, and your wealth that went to feed that beast. But so the harm is not just in Afghanistan and Libya and Syria. The harm is at home as well. But it's happening in small increments. So people grumble a little bit, they get used to it. Oh, okay, so we have lead in our water. Okay, so our kids have 30% reduced IQ. Okay, not good, but life goes on. But it shouldn't be that way. In the United States, you should have clean water everywhere. You should have, life should be much better than it is. And the reason why it's not is because of all this war spending and empire building.
No, I agree with you 100%. There was a old documentary called Iraq for Sale, which is a really good a documentary, and it was all about the contractors and how much money they got and how recklessly we spend our money. There was even there's a series called American Greed, and I didn't watch it really ever, but I just happened to fall on this episode. I think it was on about this this company. There was like these two sisters who had a company that would ship things overseas for the military, and on one of their invoices they accidentally like messed up the total and like, I don't know, like added some zeros or something like that, and the military just paid it. And then they just kept doing it and doing it, and they just kept paying and paying. And like there was even one time, because they could have got away with it, but because there was this one time where somebody said, hey, I think you messed up on this invoice, like you overcharged us a bunch or whatever, and like, oh yeah, we'll correct it, sorry. And then they waited a little bit and they started doing it again, because by then they were already addicted to the money. They were living like these amazing lives, and eventually they did end up getting caught. But what was interesting to me was just how easy it was for them, like, and that's taxpayers money. Was just like, what, you're just like, there's people, I mean, we have a little family construction company, and we had a pretty horrendous season this year, and things were on back order. It's like work slowed down, and then when we finally got some work, materials weren't available to even do the work, so then we were kind of stuck, and so we had a pretty bad year. And then obviously this podcast isn't for money, so like it's just you have people like myself who it's like, wait, like I'm struggling, and you guys are just throwing money around. Like I still pay my taxes, I still get taxed, and I still and you guys are literally just throwing money around like it's nothing. I just said this on a recent podcast too, about how the stimulus checks were sent overseas to family members of mine who live in France, live in Portugal, who have not been in America for like 20-30 years, and they were getting the stimulus checks. And it's just like, how do you stimulate American economy when you're not in America. It's like it doesn't make any sense. It's just like,
That's incredible.
isn't that wild? And it was actually my mother who first told me. She's like, "Oh yeah, your uncles and they all got the checks overseas." Like I'm like, how do they even know where they live? I'm like, but it was and I talked to other foreigner friends of mine, and they said that they had similar experiences where they had family members who at one point lived in America, and then went back home, and they were getting the checks, and it's just like, so you have people struggling, and yet like they just throw this money around like it's nothing, and it just boggles my mind. That's why I always have this like this weird relationship with like socialist ideas, because in a way I love people and I care for people and I want everybody to do well. So it's like, in theory, like I want to help everybody, and it makes sense, but in practice it doesn't turn out that way. And I have a lot of Polish friends who come from communist countries, and Eastern European friends. One of my friends who actually this is Jersey, he's an Estonian friend of mine who plays basketball overseas. And you talk to these people who come from Eastern European countries, and they have a hatred for anything socialistic. You lived in Venezuela for a little bit, which will, and now you live in Monaco, which is Monaco basically would you could put it in the category of a socialist economy? I mean, there's no
No,
really as
no, not so much. And Venezuela, when I lived there, it wasn't the same as now. I lived there in the early 1990s. Venezuela was a mess back then as well. Probably it was a worse mess than it is now. So when I lived there, it was still under the president was Carlos Andres Perez, who was well, basically the empire puppet. Most of Venezuela's wealth was getting siphoned off abroad. 80% of the population was living under the poverty level. The crime was rampant. The national hobby was reading Monday papers to see how many people got killed over the weekend. And so like they would, yeah, really, that was like they would only count gunshot or knife wounds. Okay, so if you died from a gunshot or a knife, you were counted. And the lowest number I ever saw was 16, and the highest number I saw was over 100. Right, so just over the weekend, just Caracas, yeah. So and then like you had these things where that if you drove after dark, you never stopped on a red light. You just kind of slowed down, looked left and right, and just went, because if you stopped, there was a good chance that somebody was going to come open your door and kidnap you or rob you. Daylight robberies, right, like right in the middle of the street, were commonplace. Where like if you have a nice pair of sneakers, somebody might just even kill you over them. So that was.
But isn't Venezuela almost an example? Because one thing you see a lot, and I want to get your opinion on this, because I'm fascinated by all this, because I'm so undecided, and I try to look at all perspectives of things. Like a lot of people would say the reason why Venezuela and other socialist countries, like I just had a Greek guest on, who has the YouTube channel Ancient Greece Revisited, and then a great podcast that he started during the lockdown called the On Tyranny podcast. And I've heard him talk about and I wonder if Venezuela is similar, and I think it is, where from the outside looking in, you look at Greece or Venezuela and you say, hey, look at these examples of socialism being a complete failure. And then you go in with a magnifying glass and you're like, oh shit, it's not that simple. There's a lot of other things going on, right?
Yeah. So basically this socialism capitalism thing is largely a false dichotomy. I'll try to explain it, but before I do, I'll give you a different example of socialism, because I grew up in former Yugoslavia, which was a socialist regime under a communist one-party rule. Okay, and I'm being very honest here. I had a wonderful childhood. We were almost completely free. Life was very good. Okay, it was very safe. The first time I ever saw iron bars on windows was when I went to live in Venezuela. I've never seen that before, you know, because in the former Yugoslavia, crime was so low that nobody had bars on their windows. You know, you didn't really need to lock your doors and so forth. The pensions were distributed in cash once a month. The postman had all the cash in his big postman bag, and we knew like one Thursday a week, but nothing ever happened, you know. All my childhood, it was like that. We had my parents, you know, we were not wealthy, you know, the income disparity was not that great. So maybe the CEO of a company made 3 times the salary of the lowest paid worker. But, you know, nobody was in debt. We went every year, the whole family, we went for a skiing vacation 1 week to either to Austria or to Italy. We had spending money. We very often went across to Italy for shopping or to Austria. And so life was very good. Life was honestly very good. Okay, now I'll try to explain it so that people may understand where the rub is. Okay, so it goes back to the monetary system. Okay, and this may seem a little bit technical, but I think it's worth understanding because you can't fix it unless you understand it. So you have a fraudulent monetary system where all the money in circulation comes into existence as a loan. You know, for any dollar or euro or yen to come into circulation, somebody had to take out a loan where the bank, a commercial bank, created that currency as their client's debt, which has to be repaid with interest. Now, the interest never goes into circulation, right? So let's say you borrow $100,000 from a bank, and after 20 years, you have to repay double that. But only $100,000 went into circulation, right? So how can you repay 200? It's impossible. So the only way that the system is floated up is by other people going into debt and always adding, right? So like the whole thing is actually literally a Ponzi scheme, which only is stable if it grows. If it doesn't grow, it immediately starts to collapse. Okay, so the problem here is that the system in and of itself has a problem that's called deflationary gap. Okay, and the deflationary gap is because if you pump a certain amount of currency in the system, okay, let's call that all the invoices, all the money that's all the incomes and all the costs are part of the same thing, right? Because it's what's a cost to you is income to somebody else. The problem is that people normally retain part of their income as savings, right? So if all the production, all the services, and all the goods that are put on the market in this system are priced at, let's say, some level of aggregate prices, but people retain part of that money in savings, then you can't sell all the output at the full aggregate price. So to sell all the output, you have to lower the price, right? Okay, that means that a lot of people are not going to be profitable. That means that a lot of people are going to have to cut back production. And so what you get is like a so-called deflationary debt spiral. Deflationary death spiral, sorry. Okay, so In order for that purchasing power that has been removed in terms of savings to come back into the market as purchasing power, usually the government has to step in and pump that money back into the system. Normally, you know, like if you go to school and study economics, they tell you, no, you know, the whatever is retained, held back in savings is then put back into the system as investment, but in practice that doesn't happen really. So inevitably in every economy based on this monetary system, it's always the governments that have to bridge this deflationary gap. It's called deflationary gap because it causes deflation. You know, purchasing power is reduced, people have to reduce prices of their output in order to sell everything that they produce. The reduced price causes deflation, and that deflation is becoming reinforced. So the system normally without government intervention would eventually stabilize at a depression level of activity. All right, so where does the capitalism socialism dichotomy figure into this? Basically, in what you call capitalist system today, the money that the governments pump into the system goes top down. So it goes to big agriculture, it goes to the military industrial complex, it goes to the, you know, like there's all kinds of stuff government gives out to educational, the oil companies receive hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies. Whereas in socialism, in what you call the socialist economies, that money, for the same reason, goes bottom up. So they keep full employment where they don't need to keep full employment. They keep companies in business by giving them business. They make sure that everybody has a job. They give bigger salaries. They distribute money to local governments for various projects like schools, libraries, and so forth. So basically, what today you would consider capitalist system is where government money goes to big corporations and banks. What you would call socialist system is where government money goes from the bottom up. If the money goes from the bottom up, then, you know, people just choose how to spend it. So you'll have, you know, like your taxi drivers, your car mechanics, your bakers, and your hair salons will be better off. Whereas in quote unquote capitalist system, your military industrial complex will be better off, your big corporations, your CEOs, and so forth. Either system is socialist because it's floated up by government intervention. Both systems, except on the one side you have socialism for the corporations, on the other side you have socialism for the small people and small companies. So the dichotomy is entirely false. Both systems, if they use this fiat currency, fractional reserve banking, where money goes into circulation as debt, inevitably you will get government intervention. Government intervention will inevitably snowball and be bigger and bigger and bigger. If you look at all the so-called capitalist countries, their public debt to GDP is now over 300%, meaning that the governments in all these quote-unquote capitalist countries are now in debt by more than 3 times their aggregate output. So the only difference is that the ordinary people don't see much benefit from this, whereas in countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and so forth, maybe the lower stratum of the society gets a bit more social support. I don't know. I know that's slightly a complex argument, but I promise you, it's worth understanding, because otherwise we're always going in circles where, some people, the minute you say socialism, they cut you off. They don't want to hear a thing you have to say. On the other side, when the minute people say capitalism, the other side doesn't want to hear a thing. But both systems are capitalist. Sorry, both systems are socialist, because both systems inevitably require government intervention that inevitably snowballs, balloons, and eventually ends up in default or hyperinflation.
Yeah, well, I've always said that how it's like one ideology helps the rich, the other ideology helps the poor, and the middle class gets screwed by everybody. It seems to be, seems to be the case. I think people should definitely watch James Corbett's was it Century of Enslavement? It's a great documentary on the history of money and Federal
Yeah,
Reserve.
yeah, yeah.
Zeitgeist Addendum, I believe it was Addendum, the second one, that he goes into how basically banks make money out of nothing, and by, like you said, loaning out money that doesn't exist, they only have to have a certain percentage of it actually, whatever that percentage is now. But
that percentage now is pretty much zero.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty much zero. It used to be, I don't know, 5%, 10%. They've created the whole new system of loopholes and everything where it's pretty much zero.
Do you buy into the argument that if you had no government intervention and you just let capitalism work on its own, that it'd be a better system?
You would have a different monetary system. You would really need a different monetary system, because the current monetary system is well, it's fraudulent. It's just basically fraudulent, and it carries, from the get-go, it carries the seed of its own demise. It's mathematically inevitable, because you're always putting money into circulation that represents debt. The debt always has to be repaid back with interest, except that the interest never goes into circulation from the banks that create the money. So it always has to grow. Anyway, like what you see in the news, if you follow the news, like the financial and economic news, is they always try to achieve economic growth. It's like achieving economic growth is practically unquestioned, except you can't grow something forever. Like it can't grow forever. At some point, like you have all the clothes you need, you have roof over your head, you have enough car, you have enough gadgets. Like it's hard to.
That incentive of constantly needing to grow for stockholders, and maybe this even goes into the conversation about the pros and cons of companies going public, because the thing about companies going public is that now you make short-term decisions for short-term gains, and you always have to show some type of, like you said, just basically growth. Always show growth every quarter, show growth, which means it would give companies incentive or motivation to do things that are not so moral, to continue getting those numbers and profits, right?
Yeah. And like I remember a few years ago, Jeremy Grantham, he's a hedge fund manager. He made this argument about the absurdity of economic growth, which I've shared it with some people. Like usually the educated type of people tend to reject these things, but basically, if I remember it broadly, I will probably make a few mistakes about reinterpreting his argument. But basically, he said, like, if 3,000 years before Christ, all of humanity's possessions fit into 1 cubic meter, so that's like what, like 3 cubic feet, more or less, into a box of that size, and that represented all the wealth that humanity possessed, and then the economy was meant to grow that wealth at 5% a year or 3% a year, I forget exactly, what would be the size of that by the time Christ was born in the year 0? And the answer to that question was that it would be something like 27 times the size of the galaxy, of the Milky Way galaxy. Something completely absurd, okay? And then usually, you know, the way people reject this is like, oh yeah, but you know, today the modern economy is like services and blah blah blah. You know, like they'll rattle off some kind of, but you know, like that's just not right, because the human economy still mostly consists of simple things like roof over your head, food on your table, transport, entertainment. You know, like you can name the key things on 10 fingers of your hands, and that's that. You know, it doesn't go much beyond that. It's, you know, like all this like banks buying repos and selling repos and having 100 trillion balance sheet of derivatives. That's not real economy. That's not what you and I need to live our lives. That's fluff and foam that gets added. The real economy is the real stuff, you know, food, clothes, shelter, transport, entertainment, education, healthcare. That's it. You know, there's a few marginal things, you know, travel, vacations, you know, but it's all there. You can't grow that forever. The system is inevitably unsustainable, and if it's unsustainable, it has to collapse at some point. In history, we've had, you know, like you've had Egypt, which had a continuity of about 3,000 years. They did not use any currency at all. You had Native American civilizations that also didn't use currency, that had continuity of, I don't know, 700, 800, 900 years. In the Cordoba, the Muslim kingdom of Cordoba that ruled most of Spain for 800, 900 years, they had a sustainable system. They used gold coins, but I think they also used secondary currencies on the local and regional levels. Most of the Middle Ages in Europe, in most countries, most regions, whatever, that was before nation states, they used dual currencies. You know, one was the sovereign tender with which you pay taxes, but there would almost always be secondary currencies that kind of lubricated local exchange, you know, on where people lived, you know, where they built their houses, where they raised their foods, made their clothes, and so forth. And so I think that inevitably we're probably going to have to go into some kind of a new currency arrangement, because the one we have today is fraudulent and it's evidently pathogenic. And one of the effects of this fraudulent system is that it almost always leads to war, because war is military spending is the only easily defensible and easily sellable way of government intervention. You know, like if the government comes in and says like, oh, we're going to do this and that, we're going to build these kinds of facilities, they always get pushback from the you know, like if Democrats want something, the Republicans are going to not want it. If, you know, like if one side wants to give everybody free healthcare, the other side is going to kill it. If one side wants to give $15 minimum wage or $50 minimum wage, the other side's going to kill it. But something about military spending always sails through Congress. And the reason is that you can always defend it on the grounds of patriotism. You can always elicit fear of your rivals like Russia, like China. We have to defend, like, I don't know, you've probably heard countless times how Russians have these new military systems that are better than ours, and they have more planes and they have bigger tanks and so on. And now, we have to do this and this and that, or they have superior cyber attack capabilities. So we have to do cyber defense. So we have to give Jeff Bezos $10 billion, and we have to give Bill Gates $1,000 billion and so on. So when you do a lot of this military spending and you reinforce, the military side of your society, eventually, like that leads you into using those systems. Like you have, as they say, like we have a great army, so we can use it. We can throw every few years, we can throw some shit of the country against the wall and break it. And so they end up doing it for real. So you have the phenomenon that in this was published in 2014 in the American Journal of Public Health. Okay, so they tallied up that since the end of World War II, there have been 248 armed conflicts in 153 locations around the world, and the United States launched 201 of those overseas military operations, which is 80%. So like there's some factor causing that one nation has initiated 80% of all wars between World War II and 2001, and then some since then. And it's not because American people are like that. It's not because it's in the interest of the American people. It's because you have this very pathogenic monetary system that then feeds the military industrial complex that then goes overseas building empires and taking over other countries' resources because they need it as collateral to keep the credit creation process going.
Yeah, another thing you hear a lot about is once you do start building funneling all this money to these military companies, if you're a politician in a state that builds tanks, whatever, bombs, whatever it may be, even if you're not pro-war, you could be anti-war, but it would hurt your local economy.
Exactly.
It like you said, like once the machine is built, and I don't mean the tank, I mean like just the machine of how the system works, you're stuck keeping it going. And then they end up, I remember talking to friends of mine that were in the military. They would talk about how they would get new tanks, even though they would have a yard full of unused tanks that they end up just selling overseas or whatever. And I guess it's another example of like we've been talking about, just how recklessly the government spends the money. And this is why, like, I see both sides of the argument where, I can see how people who are libertarian or subscribe more to the capitalistic idea that they see all the issues with government. And then I also see the issues where corporations, like we talked about too, like the need to consistently grow leads to also doing a bunch of really immoral things. And I don't think government and corporations are two different things. Usually I try to refer to them as the same thing because they're just two partners doing the same, for the same, looking to get the same outcome. They both try to get as much power and resources. They both help each other out, and we get screwed by both of them. So it's like this idea that like one or the other is about the greater good. It's like, no, governments are corrupt because they're run by people and people can be corrupt. Corporations are corrupt because they're run by people and people can be corrupt. Like the common denominator is that they're all run by people, and anywhere where there's people, there's going to be some corruption. So it's like this, you can't just detach that that ingredient from the whole thing. You can't just ignore the fact that maybe in theory something could seem like it makes sense, but there's always going to be somebody who's going to find a way to manipulate the system or corrupt the system, or in some cases, like you said, the financial system. It wasn't manipulated. I mean, it is in some ways, but it seems like it was built to be manipulated, and the whole thing is flawed. I mean, it's crazy how many people don't even know that banks just literally put money in circulation that doesn't exist. They just, by loaning it out. And I've told people this stuff and they just look at me like they don't get it. I'm just like, it almost seems so absurd, the idea that they assume there must be more that I'm not telling them. Like there must be some regulations, there must be something that factors in to keep this all in check. I'm like, no, 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 it's pretty simple. They have the green light to put money, literally they're not physically printing it, but in the digital world, moving ones and zeros from one account to another, they're putting money in circulation that doesn't exist. It's
Well, the reason why people don't get it is because it's deliberately being kept from them. I studied economics in the United States, okay, and I remember, I was in Moorpark College, California, and I had a course in macroeconomics in which, we were taught about the money creation process, like where does the money come from, and the professor would like rattle off his whole explanation, and he'd go like, "Is that clear, class?" And I was like, "No, I just don't get it." And then he would rattle off the exact same explanation. "Is that clear, class?" And everybody wants to get out of here. So they're like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, it's clear." And I'm still there like, "No, I completely don't get it." And then throughout my studies, I honestly wanted to understand this. Like, what are these little pieces of paper that, like somebody will agree to fix my car for some of that, or give me a bag of groceries? What is this? Where does this come from? What does it represent? And so, when I finished college, I bought a bunch of these money and banking books for, like for university courses, for advanced master courses, whatever. And I kind of tried to figure it out, and I couldn't. And then I was about to give up because I thought like, okay, maybe it's such a complex thing that my little brain just can't digest it. And then, like when the internet came of age, like I stumbled onto the documentary film called Money Masters by Bill Still.
also
And so,
influence of James Corbett. I think that was the big red pill moment for James.
yeah, could be. Yeah, could be. And so, Money Masters is flawed in a certain way, but it suddenly, like this partial explanation that never came full circle, so you couldn't really understand it, comes full circle, and it's dead simple. They're doing the exact same thing that you would do if you had a printing press at home. It's exactly the same thing. They're like conjuring it out of thin air, and they're loaning it out for it to be paid back to them with interest. So if you had a printing press at home and I needed $100,000, you'd say like, "Sure thing, Alex. Sign on the dotted line, and here's $100,000 for you. And now I have to pay you back $200,000 over the next 20 years. Good business." Except that you and I would go to prison if we did that. But the banking cartel has managed to legalize this. And then when you mentioned about how the system was designed deliberately in this certain way, there was a congressional inquiry into this, I think in the 90s. I forget the congressman who brought this to this report, but basically what he found is that practically every county in the United States has a military contractor. Okay, so I don't care who you represent. If you vote against military spending, somebody in your county, somebody in your district is going to be losing business and jobs. So of course, any military budget passes, which is why in the United States now, your military budget is bigger than the next, whatever, 60 countries combined. It's not because there's any risk that anybody is going to invade the United States. It's because it's the way this narrow segment of stakeholders are draining wealth away from everybody else to themselves.
Isn't also another issue, and I've heard Elon Musk talk about this, and it makes perfect sense. He talks about privatizing some things, like him going to space and SpaceX and stuff like that. And he talked about how and everybody kind of knows this, like, we also overpay for a lot of shit. We overpay. They come up with these really crazy numbers for tanks and bombs, and or to develop some plane we don't end up using, and it all just seems like a money grab. It all just seems like we'll develop, hey, this seems like a great idea, and we can get some grant money or some money from the government to help invest in this, and then next thing you know, it doesn't work out, or you end up paying too much for it. And Elon Musk, he was talking about how the way he looks at things, he's like, okay, why is it so expensive to make? Like, if I made 1 million of them, would it still be that expensive? And because a lot of these things, if it's a one-off, or you're just making a couple of them, yeah, it's going to be expensive. But it might not be that it's just expensive. It might be just a poorly put together design. And he looks at it as from engineering perspective, where like, okay, if I build 1 million of these, would it be much cheaper? And if the answer is no, then maybe it's a poor design. And you see that over and over again in military, because their budget is endless. So there is no incentive to save as much money as possible, or find ways to save taxpayers' money building things or developing things, because it's just, we recklessly just throw it around.
Yeah, no, there's even incentive to bungle things expensively, because like, I don't know, if you order like a new generation aircraft from Lockheed Martin, and you've already spent a couple of $100 billion, and now it needs all kinds of fixing and overhauls, you're not gonna maybe walk away from like a $500 billion project. You're gonna say like, okay, well, another 100 billion might fix it. All right, here's another 100 billion. And then they come back and they say like, well, we actually need another 300 billion. Do we flush it down the toilet, or do we give them another 300 billion? Knowing that if I sign off on this, I'll probably get a seat on the board of directors in Lockheed to do nothing and get paid a couple of $1 million a year. Obviously I'll sign off on it. And then I'll say, oh, but defense, but patriotism, but like our military, respect for the families, and look how bad the Russians are, and look how evil the Chinese are, and there the questions stop. So yeah, that's the whole system, which unfortunately is like a leech attached to every person's body, sapping the wealth, sapping the energy, sapping the resources. But it benefits like a small class of stakeholders that are benefiting greatly from it.
And this reminds me, I actually just looked it up because I was curious if it's still on YouTube. So many things aren't on YouTube anymore. But I looked up the Rumsfeld. Remember right before September 11th, when he said the Pentagon lost, I forget how many trillions of dollars, something like really insane.
It was I think it was like 2 trillion thereabouts. But then, like there was under the Trump administrations, they finally did the first ever audit of the Pentagon, and they couldn't account for $21 trillion. Now, $21 trillion, people get lost in these zeros, so they don't really understand what this represents. But ballpark figure, take that 1 trillion is $3,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States. Okay, so multiply that by 21, and that's a lot of money per person that's been simply stolen. So not just the money that's been spent, but the money that cannot be accounted for, meaning that, you know, it was probably spent in a corrupt way that they don't want to uh, they don't want to make it traceable and justifiable. So, you know, like that's that's an unthinkable amount of wealth that could have bought really nice things at home for you know, like if you think that thousands of counties in the United States have lead and pharmaceutical products in their water, that their water sources are never even inspected, let alone, you know, checked what comes out of the tap, that, you know, you have such an expensive healthcare system that produces, you know, undeniably the worst results of all the developed nations in the world. And I think that the answer is, you know, obviously in very, very high level corruptions that is predicated on, again, always going back to this money system, which is fraudulent from the outset, from the first loan that goes out.
That's wild, and that's why there's a lot of conspiracy theories going around about where the plane hit on the Pentagon and what was in some of the other towers that came down, and paperwork and all this stuff. I mean, when you're talking about that much money, anything is possible. I mean, that's I think when you research stuff, I think it was that interview on Around the Empire. I don't know if it was yourself or the host who said it, but it's like, think about how much people have realized the news has lied to you. So it's like, if the news lies to you this much, imagine how much of history is a lie. And it's you know, it's so true. I mean, so much of what we accept as fact is stuff that we've never looked into, or the things that we never question. It's like somebody with some type of authority or something. We always just assume somebody else did the research, somebody else did the work. Similar to yourself when you're talking about being at the university, and they're saying this makes sense, and then because everybody's agreeing that it makes sense, you're like, you could have easily been like, okay, well, maybe, like you said, I just have a small brain and I just don't get how complex this is, and I'm not grasping the concept. When the truth is, it just didn't make any sense, and you just were picking up on the fact it made no sense. You know, so I think a lot of times that herd mentality, where just like if everybody kind of agrees on something, you just assume somebody's looked into it, somebody's done the research, somebody's questioned it, somebody's fact checked it. You know, I always bring up the Hitler thing because Gerard Williams was on my show, I think like the first year I started, within the first 12 months. And I remember running into his book, Gray Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler. And when I ran into his work and I was looking into his evidence and his arguments and all this stuff, I was stunned by how little to no evidence there was that he died in Germany. And yet we all gurgitated it over and over and over again. And, you know, which was mind boggling. I'm like, oh my God, there's literally no evidence that he died in Germany. And we just all keep repeating it and accepting it as fact. And when he went to Argentina, he was working for BBC at the time and looking for, he was there for some other story. And then he finds all these books written in Spanish about all the Germans that went there, and many of them who think they had connections to Hitler or worked at the Nazis, you know, a mansion that they're living at or whatever, like these maids and all this stuff. I mean, it blew his mind, but it's not that hard to believe. And these, because that's just a perfect example of how you can literally just rewrite history so easily by just getting some people to put in a book. You get a couple credible people to accept it and regurgitate it with confidence, like it, you know, like we know this. And next thing you know, like it just keeps being repeated. And just like, I'm sure somewhere in the future they're going to keep repeating that the COVID vaccine saved us of COVID and the pandemic, you know. And if you live through it, you're like, that's complete horseshit. Now, that's not true at all. Like, so it's It's wild, but it does make you have to rethink everything you've read. I mean, Gerard Williams was eventually on Hunting Hitler. When I had him on, it was way before Hunting Hitler. I mean, the only interviews I saw him do were on like kind of fringe type of shows, and then next thing you know, he's on the History Channel, and it's like being socially accepted that it's that he possibly didn't die there, and then they end up doing a DNA test on the bones and all that. So it's just it's a huge issue. Like, I think that's why we almost need people like yourself and myself. Well, I question things because I'm too dumb I really am too dumb to grasp things. So that's why I ask a lot of questions. But it's we need people who are willing to be like, hey, no, wait, pump the brakes. Like, that doesn't make sense. Let me question this. Let me ask some questions, because it is dangerous to just accept whatever the mainstream narrative. I messed you up, didn't I? Because didn't you want to come on to talk about completely different topics? I know I just found out that you had another, when you sent me that email, I didn't know you had another YouTube channel, because I think I subscribed to you have two of them, right? You have one that's Alex Krainer, and then you have another one.
Oh yeah, I have one. Well, yeah, the Alex Krainer one is like a personal one that I set up forever ago, just like messing with it. I didn't even know what I was doing, and I posted some, very inconsequential videos. But then I set up a new one last year called Markets, Trends, and Profits, which the the source, the original intent is to be like to have like a business sense, to promote my my business developments. But with the pandemic and everything, I've become like kind of mesmerized with other things that are going on. So in addition to talking about investing and trading and these sorts of things, I've also published a few videos about current events. I published one about Theranos. I published one. My last one was kind of like exactly what we're talking about now, revisiting history that we thought we understood, but we didn't, because it was prepackaged for us in like a digestible rose-colored story that actually wasn't true. And yeah, I think it's kind of relevant today because it plays into this escalation with Russia, where some of these opinion leaders like Victoria Nuland and Adam Kinzinger are now, going around saying that not confronting Russia would be like appeasement, like 1938. The implication being that we should be ready to pay any price to confront Russia and go to war, if it need be, except that, the whole story of appeasement, as we learned it at school, is also untrue. Because we got fed this story like, oh yeah, Neville Chamberlain, poor judgment, he went and allowed Hitler to take over Czechoslovakia to appease him because he was so aggressive and powerful. So that would be a way to maybe keep him happy and avoid him from going to war. But in fact, it was Neville Chamberlain's cabinet which was kind of leading Hitler on towards taking over Czechoslovakia, because it was their agenda to create this three-block world. The continental Europe, dominated by Germany, by a strong hegemon under their control, right? The Euro-Atlantic axis, dominated by Britain and the United States. Again, United States dominated by Britain, and then East Asia dominated by Japan, which is also dominated by Britain. This was the late British Empire's fantasy about dominating the world in these three blocks. So Germany was meant to be the hegemon of continental Europe. And Hitler was supposed to be the man to make it all happen. And they deliberately kind of led him to take over Austria, to take over Czechoslovakia, and to take over Poland. Germany was also meant to be the bludgeon with which to kill Russia. Except Hitler took his role a bit too seriously. His nationalist side, he wasn't so good at taking orders, and so he ran amok, and then they had to go and defeat the Nazi Germany. But at the outset, from the mid-30s on, when they financed him abundantly, where they helped him with PR, with elections, with lobbying, with assassination of a whole lot of people who were Hitler's opponents, who were deathly afraid of Nazism and what it was going to do to Germany. The foreign policy cabal around Neville Chamberlain were actually the people who were in charge of all those events covertly, secretly. They were lying to their people at home, and they were manipulating the events on the continent. And so, I thought at this, I'm kind of, I lived through the outbreak of war in the former Yugoslavia. I was very impressed with the fact that literally a day or two before the war broke out, I think 99% of people didn't think it would be even conceivable that there would be a war in that country, because we were so, intertwined, all the nationalities, all that nonsense about the centuries old hatreds. That was part of the fake news that went along with the Balkan Wars. And so, I kind of have this fear that where we are, given the fact that war will be such a lifeline for the them, I then kind of broadened my horizons with my YouTube channel into these kinds of issues, rather than just talking about trading and investing. Yeah, so yeah, there's been a few videos that I put together that are not related to money and investing and trading, but I feel that it's important to talk about certain things that, like if the war breaks out, everything else we're doing might not matter so much. Maybe the trading we need to learn is to trade cigarettes and detention camps rather than stocks and commodities. So I think that inevitably we have to discuss these other topics as well.
Yeah, I agree 100%. In 2020 and 2021 and even 2022, I'm sure I'm going to have the same issue where even the small business was so neglected, because all I could do was research and think about doing this podcast or connecting with people or helping people connect and just do my part in like this battle, because I felt like nothing else was as important. Because I'm like, what good is it if I'm invested in the business if we live in a crazy tyranny that, it's like, what? So it's like I was so motivated to just like, I just couldn't stop. I was always like that. I get OCD about things, and I've always loved doing this podcast because I get to talk to people like yourself and who really are thought provokers, and I can bounce ideas off you and stuff. But I just feel like, putting out these conversations were so important that everything else took a back seat. And I'm like, what future do my kids have, or this country has, or this world has, if they win? So it's like, well, let me do my little part in trying to fight back or push back or whatever, and so, which is bad for business, but it's that's why the goal is to eventually do this full time, where I can kind of but I'm so bad with money, and I just, I don't like sponsorships. I don't like commercials. I don't like any of that stuff. And I just, I'm kind of just still crossing my fingers I can continue to do the show as it is. And then eventually it grows to a point where, I can just make a living. I'm like you, I don't want to be rich. I could care less about being rich. If my phone never gets any faster or newer, if my car never gets any faster or newer, if my house never gets any bigger, as long as I have friends and family and I'm rich with company and love, then all the other stuff really isn't that important to me. You know, it's I'm completely content. And I think content is in especially in like in America, the East Coast of America, where everybody's like a go-getter and be a hustler and all this stuff. Like being content is like a dirty word. It's like a word that people look down upon if you use or satisfied with. And I don't look at it like that. I feel like being content is another way of saying I'm appreciative of what I have, and I understand that I'm lucky to have what I do have, whatever it is. Yeah. Or there could I have more? Could I um are there people who have more that maybe some of us can be envious of at times? But that's, there's also a importance in appreciating what you have and not always pondering on what you don't or could have.
Yeah, I tend to agree completely. My relationship with money has been extremely inconsistent. I'm also not terribly good at making money, like in the sense that
I'll, I'll
my
I'll edit this part out just in case you you don't want to hurt your business.
no, it's okay. Like I I do a lot of things without planning about the money aspect of it. So I had very good years when I made a lot of money, and I had horrible years when I barely made any. But one thing I discovered by going like that up and down is that actually having a lot of money doesn't necessarily make me happy. Like it can make you a lot more comfortable. It can also be a little bit disturbing in the way that, like, oh my God, what do I do with this now? Because I don't necessarily have big ideas about, you know, having houses and supercars and stuff like that. So it's kind of almost like a. But the thing that positively does make me happy is exactly as you say, having good um, good environment, good people environment. Friends, family, uh, abundant time to spend together, to just do simple things like sit together around a meal and discuss and talk. It can be so fulfilling, uh, and you don't need much for that. You really don't need much for that.
Well, they've done
So
there was a study where they said that people's happiness was barely quantifiable after like $75,000 or something along those lines. It was under $100,000. It was like 75 or $80,000 a year. When you made more than that, like your happiness levels really didn't change much. And I honestly, I think even the study was misrepresenting how it works, because I think what happens is that money doesn't. It's not that money brings happiness to you up to $80,000. I think it just relieves you of stress, because I've always been bad with money. Growing up, like my parents were poor. They came from Portugal with, I always say, like, they came from a house with no running water, and they were farmers, and they came here, and they obviously didn't have any education, didn't speak or write the language. So the only way to get ahead, if you weren't making a lot of money, because you weren't going to make a lot of money if you didn't have any education, the way they looked at things was that saving money and making money was the same thing. So if you can't make a lot of money, you got to save a lot of money. So money was always a huge conversation. It was always, or a huge focus, I should say. It's always like everything was about, like, how do we save money here? How do we, so it's like, I never had many toys. I never had nice clothes. I never, and if I did, I had to save it for church on Sundays, that type of thing. And it was all, it led to a lot of stress too. Like my mother always seemed like she was stressing about, make or saving money and making sure, we could pay the bills. So it almost caused this trauma. I don't know if it's trauma. I've said it in the past, it's trauma, but I almost feel like in a way I'm like, okay, as I got older, like one thing I've always attempted to do is like, okay, let me try to filter out as many things in my life that causes stress, and then try to expand on the things that bring me happiness. And if I do more of the things that bring me happiness and puts me in a good mood, that means I'll be in a better mood more often, which means I'll be a better husband, I'll be a better a parent, I'll be a better friend, I'll be a better, whatever. It just improve everything. So money was one of those things. Thinking about money was always one of those things that I'm like, it brought me stress and anxiety. So I tried not to think about it at all, to a point where it becomes a flaw, because it's like, I won't be on top of things in regards to like, oh yeah, I got to pay that, or yeah, I got, because and I will, but it'll be like I try to think about it almost not at all until I have to. It's like, okay, now I got to remember, like I got to do this, and I also don't think about, like, I'm not motivated by making more either, like I don't, I'm just, it's not a motivation of mine. And I mean, a part of it's like, I think that I still have that soul of that artist when I was a kid who loved to paint and draw and play music. And I always felt like, your best the best artists were motivated by their work. The money wasn't even a concern of theirs. And I also think the best thinkers, you look at Nikolai Tesla, is always the example people use. He wasn't motivated by money. He was motivated by his work and trying to make the world a better place to some extent. And then the people like Edison, who were motivated by money, were shitheads, yes, he's much more known in the history books, but he doesn't have when you really break it down and you analyze it, he didn't have the influence on the world that Tesla did. And so it's, yeah, I mean, it is one of those things where I think it can relieve stress. I don't even know if it necessarily brings you happiness. And like you said, the things that usually the most memorable moments of your life don't require a whole lot of money. It's just being around the right people and just enjoying each other's company, enjoying a good meal, which also doesn't require a lot of money, especially if you're growing stuff yourself or raising your own animals or whatever. And or alcohol, same thing. My dad makes wine, and he's growing up, I'm always like, I'm like, are you really saving that much money making it? But then I realized it wasn't about that. It was about like the tradition of everybody gathering, trying it afterwards, being a part of the making it process where people are together, that are eating and they're drinking and all this stuff, and all these things. I mean, all these traditions that continue, going to church, making wine, whatever it may be, they all have one thing in common, and that's it's a reason to gather people, loved ones, friends, and be together. And so I think that's a without a doubt the most valuable thing. People are always talking about value this, I'm like, time's the most valuable thing. And because you can't, that's the one thing you can't make more of. Once it's gone, it's gone, and
you can't get it back.
Exactly. So and speaking of time, I've taken up a lot of your time, and I know you're a busy man with a lot to do. But I'll definitely, we'll definitely have to reconnect again soon in the near future. Or so you're one of those guests that I'm like, I could just hit record and not have any game plan at all, and we could probably fill up a couple hours, no problem.
I think this is pretty much what we've done now.
You're probably right.
We just started improvising from this was like a jazz. This was like a jazz podcast.
Yeah, but I love those type of shows. There's like you, Dr. Jessica Rose is another one who, like, I just love bouncing ideas off and just hearing your perspectives on so many different things. And I find that like the most interesting guests aren't experts in any like one field, even though they might have focus a lot of their attention on one field or a majority of it, but they're interested in a lot of other things, and that's what makes them interesting, because they're seeing things from all those other perspectives also. So it's fascinating. I mean, I love shows like this, and people love shows like this because one of the things people like about the show is that, and it's not even consciously attempting to do it, but it's always what I liked about the Rogan podcast was like, if you just talk for a couple hours, you never know where the conversation is going to go. Like, I might bring something up that reminds you of a story that you haven't told before or whatever, and then we go down that path and we go. So it's like, to me, it's just as much fun, and it's as much as a journey for for us participating in it as the listener. And I think I enjoy it. And that's kind of the beautiful thing about conversation. Like, it's such a lost art, and the importance of it can't be understated. You share ideas, you challenge ideas, you filter out bad ideas. Like, that all happens while you're talking, and because I always say I'm an idiot, and so it almost gives me the green light and the freedom to do what I really want to do. And that's like, throw out some bad ideas sometimes, and throw out some things that I'm not too sure of, and just see what happens. Because I think too often the ego gets in the way of like asking, like, oh, I don't want to ask a dumb question, or this might be a stupid idea, and you keep it within. But it's like, sometimes you just throw stuff out there, and then next thing you know, it makes way more sense than you thought it did, or or it's a much better question than you thought it was. So it's that's how we grow, that's how we learn. So and that's how we all keep each other sane, because we know that there's people all over the world that are thinking and feeling similar things. So and I love the fact that you've been on the You Have Done Wanted, and that whole show, and what that does with connecting people and bringing everybody together from so many different backgrounds and different places. It's awesome, because we are all in this together. It's them against us, and they want to divide us. They do a job of doing it, but we, like I keep saying, like, we need to build bridges, not burn them. And our small differences, we can't let those things get in the way of the bigger picture.
Yep. Fully agree, Ricky. And this is, for me too, this is a lot of fun, and I love to have these open discussions. All kinds of stuff comes up and out. And I think that this is in a very real way a pushback against the tyranny that, if it went unopposed, would render the life for our children not even worth living. They would turn them into cattle fed insects and human remains, because that's what they have in store for us. So I think that the number one thing we have to do is bring out the truth in whatever small way we can. You have Joe Rogan reaching whatever, $10 million viewers on every podcast. But if you can reach 10, that's more than zero. So it's important still. So anyway, I really appreciate being on your podcast, and thank you for the invitation. And before we part, I just want to wish you and all your listeners and viewers a happy new year. And in this order: health, freedom, happiness, and then prosperity. I hope I didn't skip any.
No, those.
So hopefully that's in store 2022 and beyond that. But I think we can all contribute to making all those things happen.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I tell people all the time, start a podcast, start a blog, do something, spark the conversation, because and I think too often people are afraid of conflict, and I understand that, because I hate conflict. I hate not getting along with somebody, and that energy, that negative energy. And that's one of the reasons why I hate like running a business, is because other businesses only look after themselves. So that means that you might be like, oh, me and this person get along, and then once shit hits the fan, they're like, well, you threw me under the bus, or you're screwing me, and you're just to make an extra buck, and I hate seeing that aspect of the world. I'm not a big fan of like, oh, don't take it personally, it's business. And I'm like, well, you're personally screwing me. So it's like, I know it's business, but to me, it's like, I just have a moral compass that regardless what happens, like, I feel like it's still important to stay true to, because I still got to look in the mirror. And obviously some people just, that's not a priority of theirs, but it's, without a doubt, like, everybody can do their part, spark the conversation, talk to people, try to find similarities, instead of focusing on the differences, because that's, it's a tactic that's worked, and it's worked really well with just making us feel like we all want different things, and we're all so different. And really, like you said, when you break it down to like our necessities and the things that are the most important to us as human beings and as family members and friends, like, it's all very similar. A safe environment, some decent education, a house, transportation, like you said, all those basic fundamental things. And that's what we're all fighting for. So, I feel like we're all being taken advantage of a little bit, and we have to kind of pick up on that there's don't get caught up in the red and blue nonsense, or the vax versus anti-vax, stuff. It's like, if you're pro-vax, that's fine. Let's talk about it. Like, the thing with me is, like, I'm willing to have a conversation with anybody, and regardless how much I disagree with somebody, because I feel like, and I've done in the past where I can find some common ground, or I can find something beneficial. Like, even if I disagree with a bunch of stuff, like, there's still something beneficial in what they have to say, and you can find those things, and you can, meet somewhere, some place in the middle, because it really is like humanity fighting for humanity, and we need to realize that. So this is why I started a podcast. I don't know when to shut up. But
That's cool.
But thanks, Alex. Do you want me to put well, send me any links that you want in the show description. I don't know which YouTube channels you want to put in there, or which ones you don't, or if you have any links to your website or your books or any of that stuff, send them to me. I'll put them in the show description. So if people want to connect with Alex, feel free to check the show description, and definitely hit him up. I know you're on Twitter. I don't know if you're on any of the other alternatives or whatnot, but if because I know Getter is getting really popular now that Rogan tweeted it, and that he's going over there. He already has like 8 million followers over there, which is pretty wild.
Oh, seriously, that's amazing. Well, let's find out, because Parler was pretty big, and I did ship to Parler, and then they just killed it. So, can they kill Getter? Did they? I don't know, but hopefully not. But yeah, for the time being, I'm still on Twitter. I'm still on Facebook. I feel just pretty much like everybody else say, in all honesty, a lot being on Facebook and on Twitter, because they do censor. They are shitty, but they can't censor as fast as people post stuff, and they're not always especially good at doing that. So before something is disappeared, you see it. So I. For whatever good they are, I do appreciate all those platforms, and I'd like to be on all of them, but each one of them takes a little bit of figuring out how the thing works. So I went to MeWe, and I went to Parler, and then they destroyed my Parler. Then I went to Gab, and I couldn't figure out how Gab works really. And so I'm coming to a point where I'm like, oh, another platform. I don't know if I can handle it. And then, you have all those direct messaging things. So I sometimes forget to respond to people because I don't see, I get messages on Twitter and on Facebook and on WhatsApp and on all these platforms. I end up not seeing stuff because there's so much going on.
I'm the same. I don't know how some like people with these huge followings do it, because I'm like you. I try to respond to everybody, but I have like messages on my Instagram page. I have messages on my Facebook page. I have messages on Twitter, and it's like I sometimes you just don't get to it. You forget about it, and you're like, oh, I'll get to that later, and then next thing you know, it's like 2 months later, and you're responding to it, like, oh. But it just there's just so much going on. But Float is really cool. I've had the Float guys, Aaron Kingsley and or Aaron Edwards and Kingsley Edwards, the founders of Float, which is kind of like a Facebook alternative, and they're cool because what they do, they teach you how to download every single piece of information from your Facebook page. You can download every picture you ever posted, every post you ever posted, everything completely downloads, and then you upload it on your Float page. So it's like you literally are like copying and pasting your Facebook page to your Float page. And so
cool.
Pretty cool. So if you ever get kicked off Facebook or you decide to leave, you still have that archives of all that stuff, which is really awesome. Float's cool. I think Getter is so similar the Twitter that I think people are finding it easier to transition because it looks like Twitter kind of. It works like Twitter, like it's so similar. And the signing up process was very easy, so it didn't take much effort to kind of figure out. But I'm the same way. I'm like, dude, I don't have the time to figure out how all these things work. Each one is different and whatever. So it can be a little overwhelming. And then it's like, and then you invest that time, and then next thing you know, like you said, it's gone. And then you're like, what the hell? It's
Yeah. You know what happened to me 2 months ago? Amazon completely deleted all my account, my books, everything. So
yeah.
my reader reviews, my books, everything gone. I can't even order copies of my own books. And the reason why they did it is because they were not paying me out any royalties, right? Since December 2018, they paid me zero. And then I started like, wait a minute, like, why am I not receiving any money from you? And then that took a few months of back and forth. And then they finally, some human being from Amazon like acknowledged, and they said like, yeah, in matter of fact, it looks like we do owe you some money, and we will wire that balance in the 5 to 8 business days. And then literally 3 hours after that, I get an email from somebody else saying that we suspect that you were manipulating our terms of service, so we're terminating your accounts effective immediately, and you're not going to receive a penny. Gone. And so now, like, it took me a little while to figure out how to publish books with Amazon. Like, it's like a whole thing. You just have to set up a bank account, and it's like a proper setup, and they just do it like this. Now, among other things, I have to figure out again how to publish books. I don't know.
Well,
So
hook you up with Charlie, because did Charlie hit you up yet? Charlie Robinson from Macroaggressions podcast, my co-host on the Union.
Yeah, I spoke with him 2 weeks ago, I think, or maybe even less. I forget.
Well, he seems to publish a book every 6 months, so he'd be a great guy to talk to because he has.
Okay.
Yeah, because
does he publish them on Amazon or through some other?
Well, I know they're available on Amazon. I don't think he publishes through Amazon, so I don't know what. But he's.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna ask him actually. Good idea. Thank you. Good tip.
Yeah, because he also hits has books on some controversial topics like yourself. So I mean, I don't know what who he's dealing with, if he has a some contact somewhere that's helping him out with the whole process. But I know it can be a little bit of a headache to do it all. But yeah, ask him how he does it, because he'd probably be more than happy to help you out. And
cool.
He has multiple books. He has what is it, the Demolition of the American Empire. He has the first one that he promoted before he started his podcast, which is the Octopus of Global Control. Then he has another one that just came out too. So it just, yeah, he's done quite a few, so he might be a great person to talk to. And so is there anywhere where people can get the book at the moment? They can't, right? Because it was through
one of them, The Grand Deception, which is about geopolitical topics, is available from the Red Pill Press. So they published the book. But my 2 business titles are only available from my website, iSystem Trend Following, and they're available there for free. I just made them into free downloads because Amazon, once they kicked me off of their platform, continued selling my book, except they priced it at, it's still there, except it's priced at like $800 a copy.
What?
So I don't know. Yeah, I swear. So I thought like, no, you don't. So I put both of my business titles on my website for free. It's a free download in PDF. I can't offer hard copies, but PDFs are there for free.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, that's the thing about these rules and contracts and agreements. It's like they're all designed for the big corporation who knows how to manipulate them and know.
They are so big that when they fill the net, they can afford to be abusive, because like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Like, a lawyer costs $1,000 a minute. Sorry, an hour, and they have an army of them on retainer. So good luck. No, I think taking them head on like that is not. It's just you have to find alternatives. You just have to figure out alternatives. But that in itself is a process. Takes a little bit of work. So publishing, podcasting, making videos, then new social media things are somewhere on that list. But I only have 24 hours in a day. I have to get my beauty sleep as well.
I hear ya. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But that's why I tell people to support people. Like if I have an author on, if I have whoever is on, like if there's a way of supporting them, support them, because there isn't a whole lot of financial gain in doing these type of things. I mean, obviously some people have
Oh no.
breakthrough and they but it's you think about there's over 2 million podcasts, 2.5 million podcasts in the world. Who knows how many authors and books there are out there. Like there's not a whole lot of people. The percentage of people who really make a lot of money doing it is small. So it's like support them to any way you can, or at least just spread the word. That's the other thing I keep telling people. I'm like, if you can't support the show, just tell people about it. Like share it, review it, do that type of stuff. But yeah, that's crazy with Amazon. Just do you know what? I mean, obviously you didn't get a explanation on why they did that. Do you think?
No, I got a completely nonsensical explanation. It was just simply an allegation that couldn't be proven one way or another. They said that I was manipulating their terms of service, which I don't even know what that means, because all you can do when you publish there is like accept their terms. Just like it's not like you can go cross out lines and say I don't agree with this. Or so it was like a nonsensical, unprovable allegation. I think that somewhere within the company's plumbing there are incentives for them to do that, because as you've seen, like they're extremely aggressive when it comes to squeezing money out of every relationship. They're extremely aggressive with their employees. They work them to death and then they hide the death. They're extremely aggressive with their vendors, in the sense that it's now proven that when they see that some product is successful, they simply copy it and then provide their own version, and then like they put their own on the top of the search and the original vendor somewhere on page 3 or 4 of their search list. And then I think that I'm probably not the only author that they decided that it's worth more to retain my royalties and delete me than to pay me out and have a fair deal where they make a percentage, I make a percentage, and everybody is happy. So I think that there's in some way there must be incentives in the company's plumbing. Those space flights cost a lot of money, and if you want your valuations at $1 trillion, you have to do what you have to do. It's not personal, right? It's just business.
You're right, and I see that the exact same thing happens in construction. When Trump was running initially, I remember people telling stories, contractors and stuff, about how what he would do as a contractor. He would screw the subcontractors by saying that something wasn't up to par in regards to quality, or finding some imperfection to basically justify not paying his subcontractors and to basically save money. And some people are like, oh, that's blown out of proportion. I'm like, no, it's not blown out of proportion. I'm like, we're a really, really small little construction company, and that's happened to us a bunch of times, where like that you'll know that they're nitpicking something just to justify not paying you for it, and you're like, wait, you're not paying us for any of this because of that little thing, and it's like, wait, that doesn't seem right, and then it's like, or they want credit for something, because of some little thing that that they're nitpicking, and the game, what they're doing, they're saving money. And so I mean, that's just a part of business practices. That's what sucks. That's why people look at capitalism and they say, well, look, that's one of the flaws of capitalism, because they have incentive to do that if it saves you money.
So it incentivizes shitty behavior, and then it rewards shitty behavior. So the shittiest people come up on top. You know, if you're correct and honest, you're not as profitable as the one who's being shitty. So that, yeah, that's very unfortunate. But you know, what can you do? You know, you have to. You know, like, I refuse to have my peace and my health shattered over money. You know, like, the money Amazon was supposed to pay me out would have been nice to receive, but you know what? I don't want my days wasted in anger, and you know, I don't want to be upset about it. So whatever, I'll just find another way to publish my work, and if it needs to be downloaded for free online like it is now, so be it. Fine.
Yeah, my mother used to be one of those people. When we go to the grocery store, she would have the huge receipt and she would make everybody in line wait while she reviews it, because she would say, find that one little thing. It's like, oh, you charged me an extra 5 cents or something like that. And I, as a kid, I would be so embarrassed. I'm like, Mom, just get out of line. Who cares? Like, it's 5 cents. And, you know, and it's like, to me, it's like that stress, like you said, like, it's not worth the money, you know, like the stress and the negative energy of stressing about all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely one of those people too. I'm like, I could return this and get my money back, but it wasn't that expensive, so who cares? I'm not, you know, but you know, because of like the stress of dealing with them and complaining about the product or what, you know, it's just not worth my time. I'd rather go, you know, kick a ball with my son, you know. So it's wild, but thank you again, Alex. We'll keep in touch. I'll keep you in the loop for I know sometime in the near future we're doing another Union of Unwanted like international edition, where we're going to do one a little earlier in the day, so people like yourself, you know, don't have to be up at 2 or 3 in the morning you know, doing a podcast. I mean, the only time people are up that late is if you're going to disco. So I mean, you you get to do a podcast.
I don't go to disco anymore.
That would be funny though, if you showed up doing the podcast from a disco.
Yeah.
The only way, yeah, if you said like, hey, the only way I'm gonna stay up this late if I was dancing and drinking. So I figured I'd go do some dancing and
No, actually what I do is I try to do a siesta after lunch, because that way I can go longer in the evening.
That's a good strategy. Jessica Rose does the same thing because she's in Israel.
Ah, there you go. There you go. Yeah. That works.
I don't know.
No, because otherwise I'd be useless. I'd be like falling over.
Yeah. So I'll keep you in we're definitely planning on doing another one earlier in the day.
Yeah, brilliant. If I can, with great pleasure. I think those are a lot of fun.
Yeah. I love them, and it's so awesome to see people connect afterwards and stuff like that, and just building a community. You know, that's what we need. We need people building communities like that. So I'll keep you in the loop. Like I said, send me any links that you might want in the show description, and I'm sure we'll speak again in the near future.
Excellent, Ricky. Thank you for having me. Greetings again to your listeners, and all the best in 2022 and beyond.
I agree. I think it's hopefully going to be a good year for all of us.
Okay. All right.
Ciao.
See you soon. Bye. Bye.